Hi everyone, welcome to Compliance Panel's live webinar on GMP perspectives on working with contracting laboratories. My name is Dilip Sharma and I'm going to be your host today. On behalf of the Compliance Panel team, I would like to thank you for being part of this event. Today's webinar will be presented by Stephen Kuhara. Dr. Kuhara is the founder and principal of GXP Biotechnology, LLC. He holds degrees in biochemistry from Cornell and the University of Wisconsin. Having over 30 years of experience, Dr. Kuhara is an experienced analytical biochemist who has applied his academic knowledge to quality control in the pharmaceutical industry and also in dealing with all aspects of GLP and GMP in relation to biopharmaceuticals. Dr. Kuhara has written several papers and book chapters and serves on the editorial advisory boards of Biopharm, BioQuality, and the Journal of GXP Compliance. He has held certifications as a CQA, CQT, and CQE from American Society of Quality and was RAC certified by the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society. We are honored to have such a distinguished person such as Dr. Kuhara with us to present this webinar. Well, before we begin, I would like to just inform you of the program that's been outlined for this training session. The webinar is for 75 minutes duration. Firstly, Dr. Kuhara will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas that will be covered, and he would then share with you his presentation. I'd like to inform you that all participants, once part of the teleconference, have been placed on mute and will remain so until the Q&A discussion begins towards the end of the webinar. It is for the purpose of avoiding discontinuity and for allowing the presenter to speak clearly so that everyone present can take maximum benefit from this webinar. We also request all to hold back their questions until the Q&A window begins. 10 minutes of time will be allotted for Q&A, during which your questions will be answered. If for any reason you get logged out of this training session or teleconference, please follow the same procedure to join in again. Now that we are all ready to start, I request Dr. Kuhara to take it from here. Steve?
Thank you, Dilip. We are going to be talking about working with contract laboratories, basically. I know the title says GMP perspectives, but there are some things that we're going to talk about that strictly are not part of the GLPs or the GMPs. They are, well, shall we say, just common sense or business practice that also has to be considered. So we'll get started here with the first question that often, interestingly enough, this doesn't occur to some people. I mean, why are you contracting the work? Now, if it's just to do pure R&D, then there are no GMP issues. There is good practice. And for some of you, I will warn you that FDA is considering some sort of regulation for R&D laboratories and for product development laboratories. The current thinking is that there should be some control, and what's going to happen here is sort of open for future development. Now, if you're doing product development, there is a point, and this is actually sort of in some of the discussions of GLPs. This is that you don't have to do GLPs up until the point where you make a decision that you're going to try and develop the product for marketing. Everything before that is considered R&D, and you don't need to follow any sort of regulations, although, like we said, some sort of good laboratory practice in general should be followed anyway. But it's at the point where you make a decision to develop a product for marketing, then the GLPs kick in. Now, there is a point here. To determine the physical properties of your product, assuming you're dealing with a defined chemical entity, to determine the physical or chemical properties of your product, that is not regulated. That is just done outside of the GLPs and does not have to follow any sort of regulation. So if you're dealing with a lab to, make measurements, well, for instance, the elemental composition of your product, things like that, this does not have to be GLP work. Now, when you get into the or the so-called non-clinical safety or efficacy studies, usually these are done in animals, and these will be covered by the GLP regulations. Now, yes, you do want to do these studies in animals because basically it's considered unethical to expose human beings to your product unless you have some previous knowledge saying that your product should be safe. So this is where you develop this initial information in animals. By the way, it is considered unethical to go into animals unless you have some reason to believe that the product will be safe in animals. So that's where some of your early R&D or product development studies, say you exposing your compound to tissue culture, for instance. If you don't kill tissue culture cells and things grow fairly well, then it can be assumed that your product won't kill animals, and then you can move on to animal studies. But, there's a sequence that should take place here. Now, when you get into the product release and product control type of work, and this will include clinical studies, and later on when you get into marketed products, all of these require GMP considerations. And this is especially at the point where your product goes into human beings. And this is why, this is the distinction between clinical and non-clinical. Non-clinical studies do not involve human beings. When you do involve human beings, then you've got clinical studies. Now, at the clinical study stage and later, this is where your GMP considerations become important. Now, as far as your GLP studies are concerned, the thing to remember is that GLP includes things like, well, it's animal, plant, microorganism, or subparts thereof. And this is where a lot of people forget that subparts thereof would mean things like cells, subcellular organelles like mitochondria or nuclei, and individual cellular compartments, components such as enzymes, nucleic acids, membranes, that sort of thing. And people often forget that they're still doing GLP studies when they're dealing with without the whole organism. Now, as far as responsibilities are concerned, remember this. The responsibility, as far as FDA is concerned, the responsibility always lies with whomever is going to submit the information to FDA. It's the person that makes the submission that is responsible for ensuring that all the regulations were followed. Now, in the GLPs, there's a specific statement that the sponsor must notify a consulting lab that the study must be conducted in compliance with GLP regulations. Now, one of the big places that this has turned into a problem is where companies contract with university laboratories. It seems to be a major problem to convince university laboratories that they should be following GLPs for their animal studies. And there have been several university laboratories that have failed GLP inspections. So you must make sure that any grantee or contractor that you deal with is informed that they must follow GLPs. Now, in GMPs, you, the contractor, your QC unit is responsible for the quality of the data that you obtain from a contractor. And, for those of you without a QC unit, this could be a real problem. So you must have somebody that acts as the QC unit. I once worked for a so-called virtual company where I was director of QC with absolutely nobody else working for me except an admin. And the reason is that we contracted all our work out, but nonetheless, I was still responsible for the data that were coming in from the contractors. Now, the responsibility, for instance, you can have a contractor do all sorts of things, including test the product, and you could say that they can release the lot for distribution or whatever, but you, as the contractor's QC unit, you're still responsible for that data. And normally what you would do here is you allow your contractor or contracting laboratory to test the product, but the actual release cannot occur until you, the contractor, review the data and approve the release. That's normally the way it works. You don't let your contractor release product without your okay. Now, we're going to talk about audits a little bit later here, but, this is sort of the minimum requirement, is that if you're contracting with somebody, this is one of the things you should do, is to audit that laboratory. The other thing is that if you're having a laboratory or somebody else do your manufacturing, you, the contractor, again, should review these manufacturing batch records. And again, do not allow product to be released until after you have reviewed these batch records and approved the manufacturing. Because this is one of the places where a lot of small companies run into trouble. They think that they can contract away the responsibility for the QC action here. And the problem is that the responsibility always lies with whoever holds the submission, or whoever is going to make the submission, and then later on whoever holds the license. And you cannot say that, well, we contracted with these guys and it was their job to release the product. You just can't shed that responsibility. You still have to retain it. It's always on your shoulders. So in dealing with contract laboratories, make sure that aspect of it is always clear. Now, one of the problems is that it's rare to find a single contracting laboratory that can do everything. And, sometimes you run into a large contracting laboratory that has multiple sites, and they will tell you that they can do everything. They can do all the testing you need, but it's just going to be done at 3 different sites. And the problem here is that you should deal with each site as though it's a separate laboratory. And the reason is that if you actually do visit these laboratories, or you run into people from the laboratories, quite often you're going to find out that the management of the lab, the management style, or the culture of the lab, these will vary. You can find within one company one laboratory that's very compliant with rules and regulations, and you'll find another laboratory that's just totally sloppy and unreliable. And then the other thing is like the effects of the location. I once had a problem dealing with a laboratory in Florida, and of course I was in California at the time. And the problem was that we're comparing some test results for moisture values on a lyophilized product. And the guys in Florida were always getting higher results than we were, and we couldn't figure out why until somebody pointed out that the relative humidity in Florida is much higher than it is in the desert areas of California. And as a result, we ended up having both laboratories involved, working with glove boxes with controlled humidities within the glove box, and having the analytical balances inside of a glove box. And when we